Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Pulpit Commentary, Exodus chapter 26 verses 1 through 37. The tabernacle. The sacred furniture which the tabernacle was to contain having been described, with the exception of the altar of incense, the description of which is reserved for chapter 30. Verses 1 through 10 directions were next given for the sacred structure itself. This was to consist of three main things. 1. A quadrangular enclosure 30 cubits long by 10. Broad, open at one end, and on the other three sides enclosed by boards of acacia wood overlaid with gold, called the Mishkan, or the dwelling place, in our version usually translated tabernacle. 2. A tent of goat's hair, supported upon poles, and stretched by means of ropes, and tent pegs in the ordinary manner over the Mishkan. This is called the ohel, which is the usual word for a tent in Hebrew, and is so translated generally. Genesis chapter 4 verse 20, Genesis chapter 9 verse 21, chapter 13. Verse 31, chapter 18 verse 1, etc. Though in this chapter, unfortunately, covering verse 7. And 3, a covering mixa, to be placed over the ohel, composed of ram skins dyed red, and seal skins, verse 14. Subordinate parts of the structure were first, the sockets, or bases, which were to receive and support the upright boards, verses 19 through 25. Second, the bars which were to hold the boards together, verses 26 through 29. Third, the veil, stretched on pillars, which was to be hung across the dwelling house, and to separate it into two parts, the holy place and the Holy of Holies, verses 31 through 33. And fourth, the curtain or hanging at the open end of the dwelling place, where there were no boards, which was intended to close that side of the structure when necessary, verses 36 and 37. The fine linen covering, verses 1 through 6. Verse 1, thou shalt make the tabernacle with 10 curtains. These 10 curtains are explained in the verses which follow to be 10 breadths, so fastened together as to form practically a single curtain, or awning, which constituted the ceiling or inner covering of the tabernacle. The mode of its arrangement is not quite certain. Some suppose that it was really a part of the tent, being laid over the same framework as the goat's hair curtain. Ferguson. Cook. Others believe it to have been strained across the Mishkan, and fastened to the top of the boards on either side, thence depending either inside or outside bar, keel. The former supposition appears the more probable. Fine twined linen is linen, the threads of which are formed of several fine strands twisted together. This is often the case with Egyptian linen. On blue and purple and scarlet, see the comment upon Exodus chapter 25 verse 4. Cherubims of cunning work. Rather, cherubim, the work of a skilled weaver. Figures of cherubs were to be woven into the hangings in the loom itself, not embroidered upon them afterwards. Verse 2, 8 and 20 cubits. This is the exact length required for a rectangular tinted roof over such a space. which should descend as tent roofs usually do within about 7 feet of the ground. The comparison made in verses 12 and 13 between the fine linen covering of the Mishkan and the goat's hair covering of the tent implies that the one was directly under the other, and that both were arranged in the same way, the breadth of 4 cubits. This gives for the entire length of the curtain 4 by 10, 40 cubits, or 10 cubits more than the length of the boarded space. The roof must thus have been advanced some distance in front of the tabernacle proper, or rectangular boarded space. Every one of the curtains shall have one measure. They shall all, i.e., have the same measure. Verse 3, when the 10 breadths have been woven, 5 were to be sewn together to form one portion of the awning, and the other 5 to form another portion, the reason for this being, probably, that if all the 10 breadths had been sewn together, the awning would have been too cumbrous to have been readily folded together, or easily conveyed when the people journeyed. Verse 6, the Authorized Version gives the sense fairly. The 2 curtains, each composed of 5 breadths, were to be united by means of 100 loops, 50 on each curtain, which were to be coupled together by 50 taches or clasps. The loops were to be of the blue material used generally in the textile fabrics of the tabernacle. Exodus chapter 25 verse 4, Exodus chapter 26 verses 1, 31, and 36. And the taches or clasps were to be of gold. In this way the covering of the Mishkan was to be completed. The goat skin tent cloth verses 7 through 13. Verse 7, from the inner covering of the tabernacle the directions proceed to the external covering, or rather coverings, which constituted the real strength of the structure, and its protection from wet or stormy weather. Curtains of goat's hair, such as the Arabs still use, as the ordinary covering of their tents layered mean, and Bab, page 171, were to form a true tent oval above the tabernacle, being supported by tent poles, and kept taut by means of cords and pegs. Exodus chapter 27 verse 19, Exodus chapter 35 verse 18. See the representation in Dr. W. Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, Volume 3, page 1454, which is reproduced in the Speaker's Commentary, Volume 1, page 376, to be a covering. In Exodus chapter 36 verse 14, we have he made curtains of goat's hair for the tent over the tabernacle, which is far better. The word used in both places is the same ohel, 11 curtains, i.e., 11 breadths. Compare verse 1. Verse 8, the length shall be 30 cubits. A tent with a rectangular roof over such a chamber as the Mishkan, brought down, as tents usually are, within 6 or 7 feet of the ground, would have required a covering of this length. If the slope of the roof had been greater, the covering must have been longer. The breadth, 4 cubits. This gives for the entire covering, when made up, a width of 44 cubits, or 66 feet, as the entire length of the Mishkan was only 30 cubits, or 45 feet. It is evident that the tent projected considerably beyond the tabernacle, either at both ends, or at any rate at one end. Probably the projection was at one end only, viz. in front, where it constituted a porch 18 or 20 feet deep. The temple, which was modeled after the tabernacle, had a porch 15 feet deep. Verse 9, thou shalt couple, etc. As with the inner awning of linen, so with the goat's hair tent cloth. The whole, when made up, was to be in 2 pieces, for convenience of transport. See the comment on verse 3. The number of breadths in the tent cloth being uneven. The 2 pieces were to be of different sizes, one containing 5, and the other 6, breadths. Thou shalt double the 6th curtain in the forefront of the tabernacle. Tabernacle here is a mistranslation, since the Hebrew word is ohel tent. The meaning may be either that the sixth breadth was to be doubled back upon the fifth, or that half of it was to be doubled back upon the other half. The latter view is to be preferred, since otherwise the extra breadth would have been superfluous. Verse 10 50 loops in the edge of the curtain that coupleth the second. Rather, 50 loops at the edge of the second curtain of coupling. The two portions of the goat's hair covering were to be united in exactly the same way as those of the inner awning of linen. 50 loops were to be sewn on to the edge of the extreme, or outermost, breadth of each portion, and these loops were to be connected by clasps or links. The outermost breadth on which the loops are sewn is called the curtain of coupling. Verse 11 50 taches of brass, rather of bronze. The links of the inner curtain were of gold. Verse 6. Verse 12 the remnant which remaineth, etc. Both this and the next verse presume a very close connection between the fine linen covering of the Mishkan and the goat's hair tent cloth which protected it. The remnant that remaineth is the half breadth by which the tent cloth would overlap the linen covering at the back of the tent, when at the front half of the 11th breadth had been turned back upon the other half. See comment on verse 9. This remnant was to be allowed to hang down over the back part of the tabernacle. Verse 13 and a cubit, rather, and the cubit. The cubit by which the goat's hair tent cloth, which was 30 cubits across. Verse 8, would exceed the linen covering, which was 28 cubits. Verse 2. On either side of the tabernacle was to be allowed to hang down, like a valance, hiding so far the golden boards of the tabernacle, the outer protection. Verse 14. Verse 14, and thou shalt make a covering for the tent. Nothing is said of the size of this covering, but as its object was clearly to protect the roof of the tent from penetration by wet, it seems reasonable to suppose that it extended at least as far as the boards of the tabernacle. To do this, it must have been 30 cubits long and 14 broad. The boarding of the tabernacle. Verses 15 through 30. Verse 15 boards of shittim wood. These boards were to be 15 feet long by 2 feet 3 inches broad, and, if they were each of a single plank, can scarcely have been furnished by any of the acacias which now grow in the Sinaitic Peninsula. It is possible, however, that they were made up of 2 or more planks, since the name by which they are designated, Kerith, is thought to be applied in Ezekiel chapter 27 verse 6 to the deck of a ship standing up. The way in which they were to be made to stand up is explained in verses 17 and 19. They were not to have one end sunk in the ground, but to be fitted by means of tenons into silver sockets. Verse 17 2 tenons, literally hands. Projecting rods, such as those common in our dinner tables, seem to be meant. They may have been of metal, let into the boards to a certain depth, and projecting several inches beyond them. Or possibly, they may have been of acacia wood. In one board, i.e., in each board, no doubt, at the bottom of each, set in order one against the other, arranged, i.e., at regular intervals, the position of each corresponding to the position of its fellow. Verse 18 20 boards, each board being a cubit and a half in width. Verse 16, the length of the chamber was, necessarily, 30 cubits. On the south side southward, literally on the south side to the right. The Orientals regarded it as natural to look to the east, and spoke of the east as in front, the west as behind, the north as on the left, and the south as on the right hand. Verse 19 40 sockets of silver. Nothing is said of the shape of these sockets. They were certainly very massive, as each contained a silver talent. Exodus chapter 38 verse 27. and thus weighed from 80 to 90 pounds. It has been supposed that they stood on the ground, and formed a sort of continuous base, out of which the planks rose. But this would have constituted a very unsafe structure. Kalish is probably right in his view that the sockets were let into the ground resembling those at the bottom of a gate, into which the bolt is pressed down. Each socket received one of the tenons. Verse 20. The second side, the north side. The north side, or left hand, was always regarded as less honorable than the south side, or right hand. See Genesis chapter 48 verses 13 through 20. Probably because in the northern hemisphere the sun illumines the south side. It showed the superior dignity of the south side that the golden candlestick was set against it. Exodus chapter 40 verse 24. Verses 22 and 23. For the sides of the tabernacle westward. Rather, for the back tau pi sigma omega, the Septuagint. Here there were to be 6 boards only, which would give the abnormal and improbable width of 9 cubits. The additional cubit required was no doubt obtained from the corner boards, or posts, each of which added to the internal width half a cubit. See verse 23. Verse 24. They shall be coupled together beneath, unto one ring. This is very obscure, and might be explained in several ways. Perhaps it is best to suppose that the coupling was by the bars. Compare verses 26 through 29. The ends of which fitted into a sort of double ring, like the figure 8, attached to the corner posts, above the head, rather at or near the head. Verse 25. And they shall be 8 boards. Counting in the 2 comer boards, or posts, the boards of the back would be 8. Each of them was to have 2 tenons, like the boards of the sides, and every tenon was to have its own silver socket. Thus the sockets would be 16, 2 under each board. Verses 26 through 28. Bars of shittim wood, to give greater stability to the structure, to keep the boards in their places, and to prevent there being any aperture between them. 5 bars were to be made for each side, and the same number for the end of the mishkan, which were to be passed through rings attached to the boards, 1 at least to each, and thus to hold the boards firmly together. The middle bar in each case was to extend the whole length of the enclosure. Verse 28. And thus in 2 cases to be 30 cubits, or 45 feet long. The exact length, and the disposition of the other bars is not indicated, but it is with reason conjectured that 2 were above, and 2 below the middle bar, that all were horizontal, and that each coupled together 1/2 of the boards of each side. The length of each was probably 15 cubits, and the ends which reached the 2 comer posts at the back ran into the corner rings, which were shaped so as to receive the 2 bars. See verse 24. It is not said whether the bars were inside or outside the mishkan, but the best authorities suppose them to have been outside. Verse 29. The rings were to be of solid gold, the boards, and the bars of acacia wood overlaid with gold. Verse 30. According to the fashion, where the description was incomplete, and it could not but be incomplete in many points. Moses was to follow his recollection of the pattern, which either in vision or otherwise he had seen in the mount. This would be his best guide. For segnius irritant animum dimisa per horas, quamque sunt oculi subjecta fidelibus. Verses 31 through 35. The veil, and the ordering of the holy places. Verse 31. A veil. The veil was to be of the same material and workmanship as the inner covering extended over the mishkan, and like that, was to have figures of cherubim woven into its texture by a skilled weaver. Verse 32. 4 pillars. The contrast between these 4 pillars of the interior and the 5 pillars at the door of the tent, verses 36 and 37, is striking, and justifies the supposition that the veil in the tabernacle did not completely divide the Holy of Holies from the holy place, but formed a screen, above which the space was open. If the veil had been hung from the top of the tinted roof, so as completely to separate the two places, there must have been fire pillars, or at any rate an odd number, the interior. Their hooks shall be of gold. These are hooks attached to the pillars, for the purpose of their having the curtains hung upon them, upon the 4 sockets. The word sockets has no article. Translate, thou shalt hang it upon 4 pillars of shittim wood overlaid with gold, with their hooks of gold, and standing upon 4 sockets of silver. The pillars probably had tenons, like the boards verse 17, which were inserted into silver sockets, let into the ground. Verse 33, thou shalt hang up the veil under the taches. If the taches of verse 6 or even of verse 11 are intended, and under is to be taken strictly as immediately under, the Mishkan must have been divided by the veil into 2 equal, or very nearly equal parts. And the tabernacle must in an important particular have completely differed from the temple. In the temple, the holy place was twice the length of the Holy of Holies, 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 16 and 17. It is possible that under may be used vaguely, or that the taches of this verse are the hooks of verse 32, that thou mayest bring in. Rather, and thou shalt bring in. The clause is directive. The most holy. Literally, the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber, that within the veil, which constituted the adytum, or innermost recess of the tabernacle. The ark and the mercy seat were the special furniture of this inner sanctuary. To these is added later Exodus chapter 30 verses 1 through 10 the altar of incense. Verse 35. The table here is, of course, the table of shewbread described in the preceding chapter verses 23 through 30. Immediately after the mercy seat, it was to be set without the veil, in the holy place, or outer chamber, against the north wall. The candlestick is the 7-branch lampstand described in Exodus chapter 25 verses 31 through 39. It was to be placed over against the table, and consequently on the south side. Exodus chapter 40 verse 24. Verses 36 and 37. The entrance to the tent. Verse 36. Thou shalt make a hanging. A curtain which could draw up and down seems to be intended. When let down, it probably covered the entire eastern side, or front of the tabernacle. When raised, it allowed the eye to penetrate into the holy place. Verse 37. 5 pillars. The central pillar was, no doubt, as Mr. Ferguson long ago pointed out, one of 2 tent poles, which supported between them a ridge pole, over which were thrown the coverings that formed the roof of the tent. Its height was probably 15 cubits, so as to give a due slope to the roof. The 2 pillars nearest to the central one probably measured 10 cubits, and stood in line with the 2 walls of the Mishkan. The outer pair would then have a height of 5 cubits, and support the 2 extremities of the goat's hair covering, their hooks. The hooks whereby the hanging was attached to the pillars. Compare verse 32. Sockets of brass, i.e., of bronze. These were probably let into the ground, like the other sockets.